up, y'all, and welcome to the Idea Space. I'm Yancey Strickler. 3 years and a lifetime ago, I was having lunch with the author John Higgs in London. I asked John, a man of weird and wonderful taste, if there was anything particularly wild he'd recently read. I'd reckoned this crazy book called Time Loops, he told me. Days later, I was devouring the book in increasing amazement, grateful for John's recommendation. Today, Eric Wargo, the author of that book and a brand new book, joins us on the Idea Space for one of the most mind-bending conversations I've literally ever had. Over the course of 2 incredible hours, Eric Wargo completely changed how I think about dreams, time, consciousness, and the fundamental construct of my life. I'm certain that as you hear what he has to say, the same will happen to you. Rather than try to summarize Eric's incredible ideas, I'm going to let him explain. So enjoy a wild conversation about dreams, premonition, and the long self. So Eric, thank you for being here. It's great to meet you.
It's great to meet you, Yancey. Thank you for having me on.
So I wanted to start by asking if you could tell us about a paper by a Cornell psychologist named Daryl Bem, and the paper is called Feeling the Future. So what is this paper about?
Right. Okay, so this was exactly a decade ago, 2011, came out. It was a major kind of bombshell sort of in the field. Daryl Bem is a very eminent personality psychologist at Cornell who, after a long and distinguished career, sort of turned his attention to parapsychology. And there are interesting reasons for that. But he conducted over the span of, I think, the better part of a decade, he conducted a series of large experiments with undergraduates at Cornell, where he would put students through these tasks that were very typical, standard kind of psychology paradigms. But he would reverse the stimulus and response in these tasks. So, for instance, there was a kind of a word recall task, where typically you'd present, have students study a word list, then you'd have some kind of study phase where you reinforce some of those words later, and then you'd test the kids, okay? Well, in this case, he reversed those last 2 sequences. He had them study a word list, tested them, and then subsequently reinforced certain of those words. Okay, well, lo and behold, the words that were subsequently reinforced, they recalled better on the test prior to that, okay? So, what's going on here? And in his...
So say that again. So people did better on words they were shown
after the
they
test,
took it.
Right. And in his most famous finding from this group of studies, he showed students, they were asked to pick which of 2 curtains on a computer screen had a picture behind it, okay? And in fact, there was no picture behind either of them when they made their choice. It was randomly chosen as they made their button press. It randomly chose which curtain was the one with the picture. Okay. The students were more accurate than chance at guessing which curtain would reveal a picture when the picture was erotic versus when it was just a boring scene of some kind. Okay.
So just to say that again, so they were shown 2 great blocks. You have to say which one of these has a picture behind it.
Right.
Computer would randomly put image behind one of those blocks. And
right.
If the image happened to be pornographic, erotic in some way, people were more likely to guess it.
Exactly. Theoretically, they should only be right 50% of the time. And he had a big enough sample pool, and the task was repeated enough times that it was statistically significant, and it should have been right around 50%. But But when pictures were erotic, they did better than that. Okay. Anyway, he did a number of studies of that nature that were temporally impossible, impossible in terms of our common sense understandings of causation, and got significant findings on, I believe it was 9 studies, and I think he got significant findings on 8 of the 9. And it was a big sample. And so he wrote this up and submitted it, and it went through peer review, and it was accepted, but it was hugely controversial, as you can imagine. And even the editors of the journal wrote a special preface acknowledging that they found this very perplexing and troubling, but they felt that they had to publish the finding. I at the time, I came across this study because I at the time was an editor for another psychology organization, and man, people in my organization were mad about this paper. They really, really got upset, and even were going to, write a letter saying, findings of this kind should never be published because it's preposterous, and so on. So for me, it was a real education in the hostility toward
Toward what? So what is?
toward ESP, but toward ideas that just don't that go against our assumptions. And that's not the way science is supposed to. That's not what science is supposed to be. But unfortunately, science, like anything else, it's a human institution, and it's there are all kinds of forces that constrain what people feel like they can study and what they can believe. It's like anything else. There's no conspiracy here. People often ask me if I think that there's a conspiracy to suppress precognition, and no, there's no conspiracy out there. But institutions are conservative in all kinds of ways, and this was a reflection of that.
So in this paper, Feeling the Future, how did the authors try to explain what they observed?
They didn't try to explain it. I mean, Daryl Bem offered hypotheses and alluded to a long history in parapsychology of trying to make sense of impossible findings that have been gathered for close to a century now. Well, really over a century if you date it from the beginnings of psychical research in the Victorian period. But it really parapsychology became a science in the early 1930s. So 90 years, basically, 90 years of history of studying ESP and gathering statistically significant results for not only precognition, but other phenomena like clairvoyance, what is now called remote viewing, and telepathy. So he didn't make any kind of grand theoretical claims about what's going on here, but it was a strong statement of, hey, there's something going on here. People need to study this more. And one of the important things about Feeling the Future was that all of these studies, all these paradigms were very simple. They were very simple for other researchers to replicate. Okay, he made it very simple. He made the experimental setup very simple, and he made the statistical analyses very simple, so that it would be very easy for other labs to go ahead and try and replicate his finding, because that's a really important part of science. And initially there were a lot of, the skeptics came right out and said, well, this can't be replicated, and it's not been replicated here. I tried to do the study, I didn't get any results, blah, blah, blah. In fact, quite a lot of other labs, I think 83 other studies from other labs, and then he did some subsequent replications as well, supported this finding. He published a meta-analysis subsequently of these studies, and had trouble getting that published anywhere. I mean, no one would really touch this. So, but the bottom line is it did replicate.
So he doesn't try to explain it.
No.
How do you explain it?
Yeah, well, this is what I've been thinking about for the last 10 years and written 2 books about now. I I think a lot of lines of evidence from a lot of different fields are sort of converging on a possible explanation for this. And it's going to have to do with the brain. This is not about, this isn't a spiritual phenomenon, although I believe that spirituality can very much involve the brain and its tricks. Um, but let's start with physics. In physics, it's become much more accepted by a growing number of quantum physicists that at the smallest scales in nature, causes go both directions. And the fact that we only perceive cause going one direction is an effect of entropy and things happening on a larger scale. But on the tiniest scales of particle interactions, there's really no way of telling. Temporal directionality is a lot less meaningful there. Number two, what's really even more interesting is just in the last few years, there's been a growth of research in quantum computing. Okay, and that's where you try to scale up these tiny quantum effects into something that we can kind of use to create a quantum computer. And what they're finding in quantum computers is that you can reverse the temporal direction of a computation. Okay, so effectively, it kind of means you could produce an output before an input.
Say that again.
You could theoretically produce an output before an input in a quantum computer because you can reverse the direction, the temporal order of a computation. Now, I'm not an expert in this field, so the details are lost on me as well. But this supports the notion that there are ways to scale up this kind of uh, causal directional indeterminacy that goes on at the very smallest scales in nature, and that quantum computers are one way to do that. Now, okay, let's take it to another field. Quantum biology is an emerging field over the last just 2 decades. Just a little over a decade ago, it was discovered that uh, that plants are essentially quantum computers because photosynthesis uses some of these same principles, quantum principles. And since then, these things have been identified in a lot of different biological processes. Okay, now there has been a search for, I think, 3 decades now for quantum processes going on in the brain. Okay, because if there's anything in nature that ought to be a quantum computer, it would be the brain, right? So, and there's growing evidence for this possibility that at least certain structures within neurons called microtubules might have quantum computing process properties. Okay, if that's the case, if that proves to be the case, that may be your explanation for how this works. Because one thing that microtubules do in neurons is they reshape the tips of neurons as they form connections to each other. They are involved in processes of memory and learning. Okay, because that's what memory and learning is. It's the formation of new connections and the reinforcement of those connections as they're used, or the withdrawing of connections that aren't used. That neural plasticity is sort of the basis of memory and learning processes in the brain. Now, if those molecules that are controlling that process are getting information about their own futures, they're able to pre-spawn to information ahead in time, even if we're talking a few seconds or whatever. I mean, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of these things, daisy chained together. That's a potential mechanism where our learning processes, our connectivity in our brain as a function of memory, is influenced by experiences ahead in time and not just in the past, the usual way we think of memory. And In fact, when you study precognition and how it manifests in real life and in laboratory life, it looks an awful lot like memory, but just memory going in the wrong direction. It looks like memory for things future, and it's been characterized. Precognition has been characterized that way by a number of researchers over the years. I'm not the first to say that, but the similarities to memory are just obvious if you pay attention to the research findings and to the sort of anecdotal data, the vast anecdotal data of dreams. Research on dreams. Let's put aside all that stuff. Dream research has converged in the last several years on the idea that dreaming is essentially the process of new memories being formed. And there was a researcher named Sue Llewellyn at the University of Manchester who published a really wonderful and important paper 8 years ago that really put together kind of all this neuroscience research on dreams and dreaming and memory with the ancient art of memory, if you've ever heard of that. This was the method that in pre-literate societies or non-literate societies people used to remember information, and we do it all the time. I mean, we're always using these mnemonic techniques without realizing it. But she noted that and anyone who really works with dreams and the art of memory it'll be obvious to them that dreams are just like memory images. They are absurd, strange scenes. They take place in a spatial setting, and they encode information about waking life events. And if you just have an eye to that, dreams really become very illuminated. And it actually corresponds really closely to what Freud argued back at the turn of the last century. He didn't understand the function of dreaming as having to do with memory. He believed that it was about the expression of repressed ideas in the unconscious. But if you toss out that, he was totally right about how dreams symbolize, and it works perfectly according to art of memory principles. So you combine all the quantum mechanics, the quantum computing, the quantum biology, and the research on dreams and learning and memory, a picture starts to cohere. And the picture makes a great deal of sense of the huge body of, again, anecdotal data on precognitive dreaming that I have studied, both in my own life and in the lives of many people who send me their dreams via email or Twitter or whatever. I have a huge huge growing data set on this stuff.
So to go back to the feeling the future study, so you would be saying there that some students did better on the test because they were remembering words that they were shown later. They
Actually,
were remembering something that hadn't quite happened yet, or it gave them some additional information, even though it hadn't yet occurred.
it wasn't that students were graded against each other. It's not that some students did better. It's that the words that they were shown after the test, they remembered better.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. And so, and to speak to the quantum piece, there's a few examples you show in the book in both of your books to illustrate kind of how to think about quantum. One is about an experiment involving Bohr, right, showing how electrons will move before something happens, and then another one showing how certain molecules will seem to travel as if they knew the path ahead of time. It's like there's some notion that they are sort of pre-selecting a path as they go.
It's
Is that the
called,
kind of stuff you're talking
yeah,
about?
that's called quantum tunneling. Yeah, that's the phenomenon actually that's at the heart of photosynthesis. It turns out that electrons kind of know where they're going as they travel through the plant cell to the molecule that changes into chemical energy from photons. Yeah, so it's
And the phrase you use to talk about this is retrocausation.
Right.
Retrocausation.
Yeah.
So can you what is retrocausation?
Yeah, that's just what it sounds like. It's causation going in temporal retrograde or in temporal reverse order. So an event in the future causing one in the present, or conversely, an event in the present causing an event in the past.
So you've written two books on this topic, Time Loops and Precognitive Dreamwork and the Long Self. You have a blog, The Night Shirt, where you write about dreams. And you've also, something I want to get to later, kept a dream journal for a couple decades at this point. This idea of retrocausation, or the idea that dreams are premonitions, did you always think this? How did you come to this place?
No, not at all. And it was partly Daryl Bem's article that got me to rethink my assumptions. I've been interested in dreams for really all my life, and since graduate school, I was kind of steeped in Freud and a lot of psychoanalytic writers in graduate school, and that got me to pay close attention to my dreams and to start keeping a dream journal, which I did pretty assiduously starting in the mid 1990s, and kept an electronic dream journal. I mean, in Word files. Like at that point, it was Word perfect, and in fact, my oldest dream journals I can't access anymore because I no longer know the passwords to my old Word perfect documents and wouldn't know how to retrieve that. But so yeah, I have decades of electronic dream journals, and then I stopped transferring them to electronic files when my first daughter was born 5 years ago because I just don't have time anymore. So I have like a lot of like handwritten notebooks that are a lot harder to search from the last few years. But yeah, so I've kept detailed dream records, and in the course of my own journey, explored a lot of different interpretive approaches. I began with Freud, but of course, inevitably one gets interested in Jung and tries that on for size. But the mnemonic, that the fact that I also sort of studied and practiced the art of memory. Uh, I too, I think anyone who kind of studies both of these things sees the similarity, sees that there's an overlap there. And so I had been working with my dreams, uh, and gained great insight into how dreams work. I think from studying the art of memory myself, and then, but no, it wasn't. It wasn't until Daryl Bem's article, and around that time, I was getting interested in ESP, um, for a number of other reasons, having to do with a UFO sighting, for one thing. um, is psychic phenomena come up again and again in the literature on UFOs. So I was starting to take this topic seriously, even though I had a knee-jerk skepticism about anything ESP related. My parents were psychologists. Psychologists are very hostile to anything related to psychic phenomena. But Daryl Bem's article and a few other things I read kind of forced me to reconsider that doubt. And one thing that helped was the fact that I had dreams that very uncannily foreshadowed something that was about to happen in my life. I had a dream on 9/11, on the morning of 9/11. It wasn't of planes crashing into buildings, but uh, it, it had a pair of identical square buildings with corrugated facades, just like the towers. In the dream, they were mosques. I wasn't thinking about Islam at all at that time. And they were in a setting that I specifically associated with suicide. Okay. So those things, like, that's weird. I had that dream, a couple hours before the attacks. I had a couple other dreams similarly that just uncannily foreshadowed something that was going to happen the next day. And I had previously just kind of swept them under the rug. And this is something that happens with everyone who experiences something so-called paranormal that just doesn't fit within our cultural models of causation and possibility. uh, you will initially be really excited and think, "Wow, what was that?" And then doubt creeps in, and you just, because it doesn't fit, it's better to just shove it aside. Well, enough reading in ESP and precognition and reading some of the early studies of dream precognition, I realized there's something here. I need to pay attention to it. And when you're and reading the literature, reading the science, inevitably you also start paying more attention to your own dreams in this regard. And yeah, when you start actually paying attention, you start identifying precognitive dreams constantly. And that then is a real paradigm shift, because you realize, okay, everything we've been told about the mind, about psychology, there's this other thing going on, and this could be huge. I mean, this isn't just sort of some extraordinary rare phenomenon. It doesn't make sense that it would be an extraordinary rare phenomenon. I mean, if the brain can reach into its future for something like 9/11, it's going to be doing this all the time, and we just don't notice it. And that's sort of the premise of the new book.
So in Time Loops, you do an amazing job of recontextualizing three of the most iconic dreamers in modern history, in Freud, Jung, and Philip K. Dick. I'd love to go through them one by one, and love to start with Freud, Anna, and the dream that made him famous.
Yes. Okay. Well, yeah, you're opening a can of worms. I can I can talk
I
at
mean,
length about Freud.
your chapter on this in Time Loops is incredible. Like, one of the most memorable pieces of writing I've ever read is the way the way you really go deep into that. But just the arc of this story, I'd love for you to share.
Okay. Well, so Sigmund Freud, contrary to what people often think, he was not a total skeptic about psychic phenomena. In fact, he believed in telepathy. He observed it in his practice, and he even felt safe enough and secure enough in the status of psychoanalysis close to the end of his life to actually start writing about it. So he wrote a couple articles about what he called thought transference going on in his lab. And he had a lot of other superstitions and stuff. He was not a total rationalist. But one thing he did not believe was the possibility of dreams foretelling the future, even though that's a part of folklore about dreams in every culture on Earth and throughout history. It simply went against the Enlightenment's kind of number one rule against teleology. That is to say, things in the future can't cause things in the past. The reason being, it was assumed back in the day, back when the Enlightenment kind of got going, that was assumed that anything like that would be a miracle, would be caused by God. And of course, that goes against all the rules of science. You can't bring God in, so you have to explain things without God. So that was where Freud was coming from too, and he even wrote a paper debunking a precognitive dream of one of his patients. But by saying, well, no, she was really misremembering, and the dream was really about her lover, and it was not what she thought. And it's sort of the same debunking tactics that'll be used now by skeptics about this stuff. But in any case, okay, so Freud did not believe in prophecy. But oddly enough, the central for him, the central key, the core archetype of human psychology is the story of Oedipus. Okay, the Greek king Oedipus, who it was prophesied, that he was going to grow up to kill his father and marry his mother, and so he was put, as an infant, he was left out to die in the wilderness, and he was then taken to another kingdom and brought up by the king of the other kingdom, not knowing that he was adopted. And then an oracle there said, "Oh, you're going to kill your father and marry your mother." And he goes, "Oh my God, I gotta flee the city because I don't want that to happen." So he flees the city, ends up killing a man at a crossroads, turns out to be his real father, marries his mother, and becomes king of Thebes, and of course all kinds of terrible things ensue as a result of this. But for Freud, well, you can leave out the prophecy part and the oracles part. That's just pre-modern superstition. What's interesting here is the marrying your mother part. That's the killing your father and marrying your mother. That's what's important. Well, oddly enough, Freud himself, the very dream that got him to pay attention to dreams and to write his masterpiece, The Interpretation of Dreams, uh, it was a dream about certain weird symptoms inside the mouth and nose of one of his patients who he was actually just treating for hysteria. Well, Freud, 23 years later, developed oral cancer. And in fact, all of the symptoms that he was observing in the mouth of this patient in this dream matched exactly what happened in Freud's body uh, 23 years later as a result of his oral cancer, and very specific details. It started with a white patch, scabs, in his case as a result of surgery, and in his patient in the dream, he could look in her mouth, and he could see up inside her nose. Okay, well, in fact, as a result of his cancer, he had to have his palate removed, and the last 15 years of his life were miserable because of these surgeries. He had to wear a prosthetic. In fact, the patient in his dream behaved shy and couldn't open her mouth because, like someone wearing a denture. It was exact match to what happened to Freud in his life. Now, Freud never acknowledged this connection, any kind of connection between his most famous dream. It's called his specimen dream, about, he called her Irma. Sometimes it's called the dream of Irma's injection. Um, and in fact, her name was Anna Hammerschlag. But he never acknowledged any kind of that this dream was a premonition or anything like that. But it's clear that it was. I mean, it was a cancer surgeon and psychoanalyst who was studying Freud's medical records, who sort of made this connection and realized, hey, this dream matches completely what was going on in Freud's body 23 years later. And so the dream is very clearly, I mean, it's a classic precognitive dream. And dreams about significant events ahead often may happen decades earlier. I mean, I've got lots of examples of this in the book, of dreams that prefigure some significant upheaval in a person's life uh, decades ahead in time. So this is not a rare thing in the history, in the annals of precognitive dreaming at all. And this is a classic example. So Freud, he kind of replicates the Oedipus story, doesn't he? I mean, yeah, and of course psychoanalysts love to reread Freud, through his own lens. But this is a lens that I don't think anyone's really, uh, uh, attacked. But Freud himself was Oedipus. I mean, he was denying prophecy, right? And in the course of denying prophecy, he sort of fulfilled it. So that's why I think Freud is so fascinating. He's just endlessly fascinating because he was in denial of not only the fact that precognition exists and that he was a precog, but I think that you can actually reread Freud's metapsychology, that is his theory of the unconscious. You can reread it very well as a theory of precognition. I mean, it really, everything he describes about the unconscious and how it works maps onto how precognition works and how it manifests. It manifests not only in dreams, it manifests in everything else that Freud paid his attention to as symptoms of the unconscious or manifestations of the unconscious. So, for instance, neurotic symptoms, slips of the tongue, what we now call synchronicities. He had a lot of examples of the meaningful coincidences in his book, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. Jokes, humor, art, creativity, all these things that are manifestations of the unconscious. These are how precognition manifests in our lives.
So was he being warned by that dream? Was he
Yeah.
was he manifested by that dream because that dream made him? Like why? It's an impossible question to answer, I realize, but why does that happen? What do you have any sense of what triggers what makes that occur?
Yeah, well, people naturally see this as a warning that he then failed to heed. Okay. I much of my new book is really trying to disabuse people of the idea that dreams are warnings in that way. We tend to think we have this sort of convenient mental model of a precognitive dream as something like radar. It's like showing us some obstacle ahead and how we can then avoid it. That idea is actually paradoxical. And it goes to the whole question of the grandfather paradox in science fiction.
What is the grand? Tell us, what is the grandfather
The
paradox?
grandfather paradox is the idea that you could have a time traveler who took a time machine back in time and killed his own grandfather, say, which would then prevent him from being born and then prevent him from being able to go back in time. So a paradox is non-allowable, in a self-consistent universe. But physicists who've actually studied the possibility of time travel, for instance, in wormholes and so on, have actually worked out the math and shown that there are kind of mathematical principles that actually prevent paradox. That you can go back in time, but when you go back in time, you're actually going to facilitate your own going back in time later. And this, I believe, is what's going on in the brain. That the brain is bringing information back in time, but the reason we don't see it clearly and literally as something we could avoid. Freud did not look in the dream. Freud did not look in the mirror and look into his own mouth and see what was going to happen as a result of his smoking. He did not see that. That was not his dream. The dream was very symbolic. It was disguised in all the ways Freud thought. But what he was disguising was not just professional anxieties that he was having at the time, as he thought. Although that's certainly there. I think the dream was using those anxieties to disguise this information coming from the future, is creating an acceptable way of this information reaching him in the past, which would not foreclose that future history. So I think that is actually really, that's another reason Freud, I think, is so important, is that those rules that he figured out for how information gets transformed in dreams, how a waking experience, which he assumed would be in the past, a past waking experience, is transformed symbolically. I think those rules are really about allowing information to travel into the past in the brain of a freely willed being in a way that ensures that freely willed being makes the choices that lead to that future outcome. Now, that's going to sound well, like, what's the point? What's the point of having this? I think that precognition is not an ability or a um, what is it, a talent or something like that. It's a symptom of something. It's a symptom of the fact that we're survivors. Because oddly enough, even precognitive dreams that seem to be about bad things, the most famous cases are always about bad things, like disasters, plane crashes, loved ones, death, things like that. But there's, even in those, there's a thread that people don't quite notice, which is the survivor, the survival of the person having the dream. And it's even in cases where it's about a terminal illness. You're dreaming about things that happen while you're still surviving. And if this is a function that is guiding us unconsciously all the time on every level, then in fact it's finding, then their lives, our cells are finding ways to survive, to avoid the worst outcomes, even if there's always, death is looming for everyone. So, you're not going to avoid that big iceberg ahead in the water of your life. But there are little icebergs here and there that your precognitive function is going to be steering you past. And you're going to have dreams that often relate to surviving some close call or some near miss, or a dream about surviving with oral cancer for 15 years. I mean, Freud lived, and this actually didn't kill him. And in fact, people now think it wasn't even the cancer that killed him, that it was probably the effects of the surgeries themselves that ultimately killed him. So I think that precognition, in ways that we can't ever consciously know is steering us past, you know, the worst and most avoidable outcomes in our life. And precognitive dreaming is showing us that.
So like those quantum molecules dodging obstacles before
Yes,
they arrive.
exactly.
And in time loops, yeah, you refer to these potential futures as twigs extending from our branches. And so they're these forks in the road where our future self, our long self, is kind of telling us the right path to go. It's giving us that instinct of, oh, I think I should
Yeah.
go here.
Hmm.
And I
Yes.
want to talk about who that voice is that's talking back to us in a minute.
Yeah.
But first, I love to talk about the story of Jung and the scarab beetle.
Yeah. Yeah, this is another one. I love this story too, and both both of these stories, of course, reappear in the new book. Uh, so yeah, Freud. So Jung, uh, unlike Freud, was he was much more open to weirder possibilities than Freud. I mean, Freud, like I said, he believed in telepathy and certain things, but Jung, he saw clearly that his patients and he himself were manifesting really uncanny phenomena all the time that just didn't fit into causal models of the Enlightenment. So, and he also happened to be working right at the early, not it wasn't really the early years of, well, yeah, it was the sort of the early years of quantum physics. And one of his patients was a major, one of the preeminent um, particle physicists of his day, or theoretical particle physicists of his day. And he wanted to explain occurrences like this, like a dream that comes true. And unfortunately, there wasn't really a theory of retrocausation at that point. And so he was working with these concepts, these sort of early quantum mechanical concepts, but they didn't really help him theorize this. So what he did was say, well, somehow time collapses in these events. We just have to do away with this sort of notion of causality at all, and say that there's a connecting principle, uh, that events are connected by meaning, by archetypal meanings. He thought, and so in 1951 and 52, he wrote a couple of papers about synchronicity, what he called synchronicity, and that's now become the standard term to cover pretty much any coincidence that we can't really explain, causally. Um, so his specimen case of synchronicity, which anyone who reads in New Age literature or mystical literature at some point encounters this story, and unfortunately, amounts to just like two paragraphs in his writings. He wasn't, unlike Freud, he was not interested in case studies. He wasn't interested in the details of people's lives. He sort of condensed people to archetypes. But anyway, this highly rationalistic young woman in his office, the therapy was not making headway. And one day she brings to his clinic a dream that she had the night before, where someone presented her with this piece of valuable golden jewelry in the shape of an Egyptian scarab beetle. Okay, well, as she's telling him this dream, he hears a tap on the window behind him. He turns around, and it's the European equivalent of the scarab beetle. It's the rose chafer beetle. These are very common kinds of beetles. I mean, we have them too. Well, he opened the window and cupped the beetle in his hand and handed her the beetle and said, "Here's your scarab." Okay. And it was this, very magical moment for this patient.
Right at the moment she tells the
Right.
dream, I dream someone handed me a beetle, he hands her a
Right.
beetle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, from Carl Jung's point of view, Jung was not paying attention to the fact that she had dreamed about it. He was paying attention to the fact that she was telling him her dream at that moment. Okay. And oh, lo and behold, here's this beetle. And, you know, but what we can now see with this model of retrocausation and precognition and precognitive dreams, what was happening was that he was simply enacting that scene from her dream the night before. She had dreamed about that scene the night before, and she happened to be telling him about the dream as he enacted it. Now, this kind of thing happens all the time. The more you study this phenomenon, but it was what we in the biz call a Dunn dream. J.W. Dunn was the pioneer person who studied precognitive dreams back in the early years of the last century. But it's a very standard kind of precognitive dream about something happening the next day, and usually something, significant and kind of big event. For her, it was a big, wow, exciting thing, because he then went on. He hands her the beetle. He explained to her the symbolism of beetles in Egyptian religion. He was already very interested in scarabs, and I mean, he'd actually seen some in Sigmund Freud's office, oddly enough, in the meeting that sort of preceded their break. So he associated beetles with Freud and so on. Anyway, he was an expert on the symbolism of scarab beetles, and he proceeded to explain it to her. And to her, it undoubtedly made her feel, wow, this is really cool, and made her dream feel very special. Okay, a valuable moment in her life. What the theory of precognition, the advantage that it has over this notion that, well, events are just collapsed in time and it's just meanings that's linking them up, is that those laws about the transformation of daily events into dream images, you can actually pick apart her dream, or what little we know about her dream, and see how that value of that moment in her life transformed that wriggling insect into a piece of valuable golden jewelry. Okay? It makes perfect sense that she would transform that moment into a moment about being handed a piece of valuable golden jewelry. She herself was an aristocratic woman. We now know a lot of details about her that were not known until just a few years ago, actually. And she was a very wealthy, she was an aristocrat, a young aristocratic woman from Holland. And she had moved to Zurich just a couple years earlier to bring her sister into treatment with Jung. And then she entered treatment about a year later. And this probably happened very early in her treatment. But looking at these events, these synchronistic events, instead of collapsing them and just saying, well, time doesn't matter, seeing how in fact certain information can pass into the past in a person's brain in the form of a dream, and then their freely willed actions can then fulfill it, really it's a great addition, I think, in our ability to interpret these kinds of experiences and events.
I mean, my mind is crumbling a little bit like a Jenga board as I think about how, Jung closed the loop of her dream. He fulfilled the dream, right? Like, and
Yeah.
And without the dream, the moment wouldn't have been anything.
Right.
And so here you have this loop, this little loop that's created.
Yes.
And
right.
And you write that the reason, and you can't say the reason why, but the things that show up in our dreams as precognitive realizations are major emotional experiences we have. Tends to be what kind of you draw. It's like things that you say maybe these precognitive dreams are like airbags that are preparing us for a moment that's to come. Is that right?
Yeah. But what you're identifying, you're putting your finger on the crux of the issue here, this time looping. I call it time looping. I'm not saying that the time itself is somehow bending back on itself. I'm using the term for convenience. I'm really meaning a causal loop. And this is the crux of it. And this is what throws people. And this is, I think, what threw Jung. Okay. Jung that seemed to him, it would have seemed to him like a paradox. Okay, that somehow he was helping fulfill this prophecy. But in fact, that's the way prophecies always work. Self-fulfilling prophecies, that's not a paradox, that's a tautology. But people, they sort of see them as similar, and they think, oh, if I helped bring this about, then that can't be really precognition. But no, that's exactly how precognition works and how we can be freely willed creatures in a universe that includes precognition. And people always ask me about the free will question. And this is probably how I should answer it, because in fact, that's time loops is how we retain our free will in a universe where information travels into the past in special circumstances, like biological systems, like brains, like quantum computers and time machines and so forth. Um, so, so instead of being thrown by it and saying, well, we have to just throw out causation altogether, no, there are really two kinds of causation, and we need to learn how to see how they interact. There's the standard billiard ball uh, causation, the second law of thermodynamics, and so on, that sort of governs material processes in the world that we observe, planets and objects and so on. But living systems seem to bridge between that kind of brute material world and the quantum world. They seem to scale up these kinds of quantum processes. This is a perennial question in biology, was like, well, how do you get life from lifeless processes? According to the second law of thermodynamics, it just shouldn't happen. So biologists will just wrap themselves in knots trying to derive life from inanimate matter. And it's a perennial question in science and in science fiction and so on. Well, I really have a hunch, and here I'm speculating wildly, but maybe not so wildly. I really think that this kind of retrocausal, the capacity of quantum systems to be retrocausal, and the fact that the living systems can scale that up, I think that's going to be the answer. And the brain is just a further iteration of that capacity. And so you have, on the one hand, you have the material world, which operates according to the just sort of the material mechanistic principles of the Enlightenment. But you have something like the brain, which is very special and operates on on some different principles, or that has different principles operating within it. And I think that's what's going on here. You have brains can carry information from the future, from the individual's future, if nothing else. And so I think that's how that's working. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. So, for like if someone who enjoys name dropping, your books are fantastic because you have such great stories about Nabokov, having these premonitions, these precognitive experiences.
Yeah.
Philip K. Dick, who introduces kind of
Mm-hmm.
precog to the common language himself, was one. He envisioned his
Yeah.
death, a
Yeah.
lot of different things, a lot of Philip K. Dick. One of my favorite stories, and it's a really strange one that has kind of haunted me, are a couple of the stories you have about Alec Guinness.
Yeah, right.
Can you
I was just
share the one about the painting and then James Dean? Both of those are nuts,
Well, I must be
nuts.
precognizing this interview because I just reread those. I just reread that chapter for the first time since the book was published, and I'd actually forgotten them. Believe it or not, I'd totally forgotten. Oh my god, I forgot about these stories about Alec Guinness that I put in there. But yeah, those are phenomenal stories. Um, he well, one of them actually you can find on YouTube. It's if he talked about it on an interview, and I think he talked about it in a few places. Uh, he was in. This was the first time that he was in L.A. Actually, I think it was his first visit to L.A. And he was being driven around to a series of restaurants. The person who was sort of hosting him, they she was dressed kind of a little too liberally, and they couldn't get into some restaurants that they were trying to get into. And he was super hungry. Anyway, they wound up at this one restaurant, and uh, they and James Dean recognizes him. He's at a table with a bunch of people and said, "Oh, come over." It's like and wanted to meet Alec Guinness. At this point, of course, he's not yet Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's sort of a young star in Britain, and James Dean says, "I want to show you this new car I got." Okay, so he takes him out to the parking lot, and there's this sports car there, and it's still wrapped up in cellophane and stuff. I mean, it had just been delivered to him by someone who'd customized it, and he's talking so excitedly about this car, this new sports car, and Obi-Wan, Alec Guinness, he has this, darkness comes over his face, and he says, "You must not get in that car. You will be dead within a week." Okay. And then he sort of feels bad for being such a downer or whatever. He sort of forgets about it, and James Dean just sort of shrugs it off. Well, sure enough, a week later, James Dean is killed in that car. Now, one thing that I love about that story is it totally replicates, the scene in Star Wars, the famous scene in Star Wars when, they're on the Millennium Falcon and he's training his young, Luke Skywalker, and suddenly, he goes, something terrible is, I've just felt like, like a million souls have cried out in pain and perished or something like that. And, and, so it's like replicating this, this scene in his future career, which he tended to disavow. But there were other cases like that later on, or actually, I think this was previous to this. He, what's the story? He had bought a painting by this, I want to say, East European painter. I'm forgetting the name. And it was hanging on the wall, but somehow it just gave him a bad feeling. And he wound up taking it down. I may be confusing the sequence of events, but he had a voice in his head, gave him the name of a Bible passage, Luke something something. And he went around his house to try and find a Bible, and eventually found one. And he opened to that passage, and the passage described exactly what was happening in this painting. And it caused him to notice something about the painting that he hadn't seen before, that there were like these tortured faces kind of concealed in these branches. And there was kind of a depressing dimension to the painting that he hadn't really put his finger on and hadn't consciously been aware of. But that this passage in Luke directed him to see what was wrong with this painting. So anyway, he took it down, blah, blah, blah. And then I think it was a short time later, he read that it was actually the anniversary of the suicide death of the artist. Okay. And he didn't know that. Okay. So all sort of weird premonitory stuff there. And he noted this in his memoir, as a kind of uncanny premonition. What he didn't note, that it was pretty interesting that it was Luke, a passage from Luke giving him a premonition, or coming to him as almost a premonition. And, the scene that he is probably most famous for, the line that he's most famous for, and he hated the fact, but that line, "Use the Force, Luke," coming as a voice, a disembodied voice to Luke Skywalker, decades later after this experience. It's all suggestive. In any case, I mean, he was clearly a sort of sensitive person. A lot of artists, this is true, a lot of artists. This is actually what I'm writing about now, in what little free time I have, about precognition in the lives of artists and creative people. But it's a very common pattern. And he was a precog in his own way, and like most people, didn't understand it, or didn't understand this ability, and didn't actively try to use it or anything, but it was there. And so those stories are really quite fun.
They are. I'm gonna quote two things you wrote. I think these are from both books. These two different quotes. You write, "We should think of ourselves as four-dimensional beings. Our behavior is shaped not only by our past, but also by what is yet to come." And then you write, I think in the other book, "We live in a block universe." I want to talk about the block universe. "We live in a block universe where the future, including the distant future, already exists down to the smallest detail. Your own future experiences already exist, albeit associatively and symbolically, in your tesseract brain right now, part of your brain you sort of write about. Dreams not only show us these experiences, they often already include some symbolic representation of our belated amazement at discovering their future reference. So let's talk about four-dimensional beings and the block universe and what, so you're, Alec Guinness, all these people are having these experiences because those experiences have already happened.
Yeah.
Square this circle for us. Help our brains see this.
Okay, so the easiest way of thinking about the four-dimensional block universe is to get rid of one of the three dimensions of space. Okay, just pretend it doesn't exist. And let's make the third dimension time. Okay, say you have a block, say like a brick. Okay, and that long dimension of the brick is time. Okay, and actually better making a glass brick. Okay, because if it's glass, you can see inside it. Okay, and imagine there's like a little red thread, snaking, wiggling through that brick for a certain length of time. It's just it's a static thing, but it's a line there. Okay, that could be your life, or that could be anything. I mean, everything according uh, to Einsteinian cosmology is a world line, really. We're just perceiving an instant in time. Time sort of scrolls from one end of that brick to the other. And so we're just seeing a cross section at any given moment. So right now I'm seeing a cross section of the four-dimensional worm that is Yancey Strickler. Okay. And what I'm experiencing right now is my, what's happening in my body. My body is just a cross section of a four-dimensional worm called Eric Wargo. And likewise, the particles that our bodies are made of are actually world lines. They're actually lines in space time.
I'm picturing that makes me picture Donnie Darko and how they have those things extending from them.
Yes, yes, yeah. Donnie Darko is a very interesting film about time loops and so on. But yes, but it's really our whole bodies. It's not just some part of us. It's our whole bodies that are like this. And what the theory of retrocausation in physics suggests is that information doesn't just travel in one direction along the line of a particle. For instance, it carries momentum, position, momentum. There's all kinds of measurables about a particle. And that's the information that's contained in that particle. But there's other things like charge and spin and so forth. And these things can be changed. Every time a particle interacts with something, it may change its momentum, its position, and so on. Well, the idea is that, in fact, maybe some of that information travels backwards. And that's what actually some interesting experiments have shown or suggested strongly, is that may be the case, that the just like in the Darrell Bem experiment, but for particles, a particle is influenced by things. The next thing it's going to hit is influencing it in the past, and that's what some experiments are suggesting. So the idea is that the fact that we're world lines and that our brain is a brain line, that means the atoms and so on in the brain are connected to themselves across time. And if some of that information is traveling backwards along that brain line, then there you have it. There you have an explanation for what we're talking about. But yeah, the block universe is kind of the cosmology that enables this to be the case. It says that there is a future, and that future is definite, and thus it can cause things in the past in a way that does not produce paradox. You can simply have causal loops in the universe. And I suspect that the universe is made of causal loops. I think that if you drill down enough in any physical system, that it's all going to be causal loops when we really look at it.
So if someone looks at this and then, one of the places my mind goes is the question of free will. Is there free will? But maybe your response to is there free will might be, yeah, but when? Maybe your moment of free will is not when you think your moment of free will is.
There are a lot of different answers to this, and one of the answer that I play with in the new book is that we are exerting our will, maybe into the past. I mean, when we make choices, our feeling of making choices and the fact that we've exerted will over an outcome, that may be kind of an illusion. But what is maybe true is that our thoughts and intentions right now influenced us a second ago, or 5 seconds ago, or a minute ago, or a day ago, or a year ago, and that we are influencing our past in a way that circles around and influences what's to come. So there's that idea. But there's another answer, actually, that I'm starting to like better to this question. And that's simply that, yes, we are freely willed beings. We exert free will just the same way we think we do. And we have experiences that produce outcomes that reflux into our past in the form of our dreams and so on. And we are influenced by those past experiences. So causality is kind of a loop, in all kinds of ways. But what it means is that if you reran the universe, like from the starting point, and if you replayed the whole thing, it would always turn out the same. And that's what it might mean to not have free will in this larger philosophical sense, in the sense that we can't change history from what it was. I mean, we can't change, I'm going to act in a way, it feels very freely willed, and it's going to produce an outcome, 5 seconds from now or a year from now or whatever. And the thing is, if I replayed the universe, I would make those same decisions again. And that's actually one potential way of reading Nietzsche's famous idea of the eternal recurrence that's always perplexed philosophers. What did he mean by that? That's one possible reading of that statement of Nietzsche. But in any event, so what bugs people about these seeming challenges to free will is that, well, we can't change the future, but we also can't know the future. I mean, the fact of precognition, it's essential in the theory of precognition, as I'm formulating it, that we can't actually know the future. We see very unclearly in a way that gets us to take the actions that lead to an outcome, but we can't change it from something that it is, and we wouldn't know how to do that anyway. I mean, we don't know what the future is, so what are we trying to change? I think it relates to people's fear of death, basically. Okay, is like, there's these perils in our futures, and like we imagine that precognition gives us a clear sense of what those are. We could then change that future, but that's not the way it works. We get an unclear picture of perils, which we 9 times out of 10 or 99% of the time are actually avoiding these perils. And because of our precognitive ability, we are avoiding them. We're steering past them. So there we have a lot of baggage about this idea of free will. And also as Westerners, it's kind of compounded because we are from a very individualistic society. Free will feels like it's kind of essential to be a Western individual person. I think some cultures don't have as much of a hang up about that. And I say this again and again, and I sort of say it in the book, and I say it all the time when I talk about this, but I sort of use the block universe as a Zen koan. Because in fact, people who study and practice Zen have epiphanies, have Kensho experiences or Satori experiences, which often are of the block universe, are of the permanence within impermanence of the universe. And it's not this sort of dismal Calvinistic thing at all. It's this incredibly empowering experience. And I'll list one famous koan, the story of the ducks. I forget the names of the two. The master and his student are walking along, and the flock of geese. I think it's geese. Fly over, and the student says, "Where the geese have flown away," and the master twists his nose and says, "Where have they ever gone? They're right here. They're still here. And that's a lot of Zen Satori experiences that I've read, have that quality. And I've had minor experiences like that in my practice. That it's like there's a permanence here, underlying impermanence, and and it's a blissful, empowering thing. It's not this kind of dismal Calvinistic thing that we sort of think. So I always sort of use the block universe as kind of a, take it and meditate on it. Take it, just really, just bang your head against it repeatedly for months and years, and you're going to have these experiences that are quite powerful.
So I've got two other quotes here by you that are worth, I think, banging your head against on a similar theme. You write, "If we could be influenced by our future thoughts, whether in dreams or in waking life, then it necessarily implies that our conscious thoughts now influence our prior actions." So
Right.
past Eric was influenced by today Eric.
Right.
And then the second quote, "Our conscious will may really be what we experience as our hindsight reflection." So that notion where you said we would always make the same choices in like every iteration of the universe. And so that conscious will that is guiding us, that voice that say we talk to, is perhaps our future self.
Right. Yeah. That's I think that's the case. Yeah. I'll qualify that to say that right now, at least, because almost no one has a conscious sense of them as a long self. I mean, this is not an idea that most people.
Yeah, talk about the long self. Tell us what the long self is.
Right. Well, the long self is the idea that we are like those worms, in the 4-dimensional block universe. We are those, we are in fact a whole life. We're a whole biography from birth to death, and with amazing experiences over the course of that existence. And those experiences are still there. The past, sort of our Enlightenment mechanistic preconceptions encourage us to think of the past as dead and gone, and they don't matter, and that the future, well, it's uncertain, and how could it possibly affect us now? When you have this conception of the long self, with these subterranean or inner kind of connecting threads in the form of precognitive dreams and precognitive experiences, you realize that no, in fact, the past is not dead and gone. The past is right there, and I'm interacting with my past, in a way that I can't directly consciously see, but I can get evidence of it in my dreams and so on. And likewise, the future is still there. My future experiences are already here in my head, and at night I can get a little movie that is showing me those experiences. That it's a mind-blowing kind of thing to have this kind of long self realization, and that's kind of where it leads when you do precognitive dream work. The point of precognitive dream work really is to lead to this enhanced sense of self, enhanced sense of one's self as a biography. I think the mechanistic sciences of mind, I'm referring to psychology, encourage us to think of, well, us as having psychology, like certain principles or whatever that govern our behavior. But I think we should think in terms of us as having a biography, because I think that's what we're really seeing in the unconscious and in precognition. We're seeing events in our lives, experiences at different points in our lives, interacting with ourselves right now and influencing us. And it's, in a sense, it's all on the surface. Critics of Freud's psychoanalysis will find fault with the idea that there's some subterranean layer of our mind that is paradoxically behaving like a conscious decider and actively censoring things that it doesn't want us to see, but yet we have no awareness of that other person somehow in our minds. Well, I think the problem is thinking of it as something simultaneous. I think if you think of our lives as we're conscious beings moving through the block universe, and our consciousness at other points in time are influencing us and shaping us and bending our thoughts and our behaviors right now, that actually is much less heretical, almost from a mechanistic understanding of psychology, and then the Freudian model. And Freud's always been sort of dismissed by a lot of philosophers because of that seeming paradox in his thinking. And I think if we, I like to say, turn Freud on his side. He describes an iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg is conscious thought, and then everything below the iceberg is the unconscious. Well, if you just tip that on its side and make the time axis, go along, so that the present, what we're thinking consciously in the present, that's the conscious, and then that whole part of our life yet to live that's nevertheless influencing us is the unconscious. That makes a lot more sense.
So I created this separate from, before reading time loops and all this, but part of what I do is I teach a philosophy, Bentoism, that
Right.
has the idea of now me and future me.
Right.
And it encourages you to picture your future self, to have conversations, to listen, to journal what future self tells you every week. And every week my future self tells me things like, don't worry so much, or, don't be so thirsty for attention. It's always telling me to calm down. It's like telling your puppy to be chill.
Yeah.
But, this notion of like dialoguing with a future self, after reading this, I thought, okay, this is maybe not ridiculous.
It's
Maybe
not at all ridiculous.
it is a conversation.
It is. And there's, even leaving aside the whole precognitive dimension, which I realize is a little radical for most psychologists and other scientists right now. There's a lot of science around this idea of the benefits of prospection. That is to say, putting yourself in the shoes of your future self and envisioning vividly how you are going to think about some action that you're taking today, in 10 years or tomorrow or whatever. Looking back, imaginatively looking back on the present from a future vantage point there's all kinds of science about this. There's all kinds of obvious benefits to it. I mean, in terms of investment, saving for retirement and making good health choices and so on. But the spiritual rewards just in terms of well-being, like what you're talking about, that future voice counseling you to relax, and other things that are going to benefit you in the future, to sort of be friends with your future self. That's what we're talking about. Exactly. I mean, Bentoism is fits right into what we're talking about. So you're absolutely right.
So I'd love to have a final sort of set of questions here that are specifically around dreams. The new book is about dreams specifically. You write about how you can get into precognitive spaces, not through dreams, through other methods, but predominantly you talk about it through dreams. And I think for a lot of people, they're going to want to say, how can let's get
Sure.
more premonitory up in here, up in my brain. And so really where you start is by telling people to keep a dream journal.
Mm-hmm.
And especially that you will notice your dreams turning into premonitions a day or two ahead of time. J.W. Dunne, D-U-N-N-E, sort of counsels this. So I wonder if you could talk about a dream journal and maybe tell us the story of David Mandel.
Right. Okay. So the number one step in precognitive dream work is to keep a detailed dream journal. I mean, the point is you have to write all your dreams down in as much detail as you have time to do and as you can do. Because otherwise you're going to forget them. Dreams are very evanescent, and memory is unreliable. So, if you don't write down a dream and then you have an experience the next day, which, I think I dreamt that, but you can never be sure you're not deceiving yourself, and you can't, and certainly can't convince someone else of this, because skeptics are always going to say that, well, if you don't have a record of your dream, you're just making this up, or your memory is faulty, whatever. So it's very important to keep that dream journal. For Dunne, the second step of what I call precognitive dream work was to then go back at the end of the day, go back to your dream records from the previous, I think he said 2 days, I would say 3, and look for look for similarities, look for resonances between your dreams and events during that window of time. Now, partly he was motivated by the fact that, your dream journal can quickly expand, and as your life expands, you have to set limits on this search. It's not that dreams necessarily unfold or come true within the next couple of days. In fact, there's wide variability. I mean, some dreams, come true in a week, and some at yearly intervals. There's this phenomenon called calendrical resonance. A significant event, you will have dreamt about it a year or multiples of a year earlier on the same date. This is a very prevalent, amazingly prevalent when you keep a long-term dream journal with an eye to precognition. But yeah, there does seem to be a way in which most precognitive dreams, they're generally about relatively mundane things. They're not about plane crashes and tragedies. They're about, an example in my book is the sink backing up, and that's that kind of minor upheaval in your day, or embarrassing, a fall, a misstep, or saying something you regret saying to a friend, or something like that. Those kinds of little emotional upheavals in your day are the kinds of things you have a precognitive dream about a night, 2 nights, 3 nights before. These are kind of relatively imminent experiences. So yeah, if you want to quickly make headway in detecting your own precognitive dreaming, that's the key. There's a third step which I interpose between those two that'll actually make you notice a lot more precognitive dreams, and that's to free associate on them. That is to say, often it's your free associations to a dream that connect to the later event, not the manifest dream itself. This is something that Dunn was not really conscious of. He didn't do that. He was looking for obvious connections. So you're going to get a lot more. You're going to net a lot more precognitive dreams if you free associate. Now, you want to hear the story of David Mandel. Okay, this is a fascinating story. He was profiled in a Fortean Times article in like 2002, and the BBC did a half-hour special on him, and you can get a segment of it on YouTube. He was a retired, at the time, he was a retired art teacher in a suburb of London called Sudbury Hill, and he had a pattern of precognizing events in the news, things like terror attacks, IRA bombings, and things like that. That he precognized when the Concorde crashed outside of Paris, I believe. And on September 11th, 1996, he woke up from a terrible dream in which the Twin Towers in New York fell into each other and collapsed. It was preceded by a vision of the Statue of Liberty, and then he saw the Twin Towers collapse. Very terrifying dream. It was a sort of a calamitous, felt like an earthquake to him. Because he already had a pattern of predicting disasters, he sketched this. Instead of writing down his dreams, he sketched and then painted them in watercolor. Anyway, he took this sketch to his local Barclays bank and had himself photographed in front of the clock at the bank to sort of provide a date stamp. Okay. And he did this all the time. I mean, the tellers were used to him coming in and photograph and taking his picture in front of the bank holding a painting. Anyway, so a few months after that, he had another dream I think he had two subsequent dreams. In one of them, planes were crashing into buildings. Okay. Well, 5 years to the day, we talked about calendrical resonance. This is an example. 5 years to the day after his initial dream, of course, he's stunned along with the rest of the world to watch this event unfolding on CNN or whatever network he was watching in England. Yeah, he's a fascinating case. And there are, 9/11 was, at least until COVID, it was the most precognized event in history, at least in terms of the number of premonitions and artworks and other things seemingly prophetic of the event. There's, just go on Google and you'll find, find a
I mean,
million
you had
examples
one
of
you
stuff.
mentioned earlier, right?
I
You had one
had
you
one,
mentioned.
sure. I think a lot, people reached out to me with their own dreams. I mean, the ones that rise to the surface are the ones where people have a vision of planes crashing into buildings or whatever. But ones that are more symbolic, like mine, it's like, I'm not going to go public with that story. I'm not, I didn't even tell, my spouse. I didn't, it's like, people are just going to look at you. Yeah, whatever, you're twisting things to make things fit, um, but I'll bet, I would just bet that, pretty much everyone, I would just bet that pretty much everyone who was watching the news the next day had a dream about it the night before. I mean, I just think that's very reasonable in terms of the theory of precognition that I'm putting forward. But yeah, David Mandel is a fascinating case. He has a lot of other ones too. I mean, terror attacks that were on the news in England. He would get a scene and he would sort of paint it, and then he would correspond exactly to like a photograph that would be in the newspaper or on the news.
The David Mandel case, I mean, there's a few things to talk about. One is you write about how people who have these precognitive dreams will often be quite distressed about them because there's a sense of, I need to stop this and I need to prevent this. And there are cases where people kind of tried to do that, but it kind of gets to this grandfather paradox question of like, maybe even if David Mandel's painting had shown like the flight numbers and the date, somehow he would have been blocked. People would have thought he's crazy. It would have happened anyway.
Well, they're almost never that specific, where that exactly, where and when this is going to happen. So who are you going to warn? I mean, who are you going to tell about this? He had no sense that this was going to actually happen. First, you don't know. We have dreams about a lot of things that don't come true, or that there's never an obvious connection to how they come true. So, there's that. Right. Who's going to, what could anybody do, even if it were widely accepted that people's dreams predict the future? How can you use this information to avert disasters? And this has been tried. I mean, there was a famous disaster in Wales in the mid 60s where a coal slip, a bunch of slurry from a coal mine washed down into a village and destroyed a school and killed, many children. Just horribly tragic event. And many people around England had premonitions of this. A psychiatrist after the fact thought, I'll bet you, he was interested in precognition and premonitions, and he thought, I'll bet this was precognized, and he solicited people to send him their stories, and some of which are very compelling, including from people in the town. But how are you going to use this kind of information, in fact, to prevent a disaster? The most compelling, I think, current case of someone who repeatedly dreams about disasters is a woman named Elizabeth Crone in Houston, who her story is amazing, and there's a book called Changed in a Flash about her, by her and about her story. She was struck by lightning in the parking lot of her synagogue in 1988, and afterwards she started having precognitive dreams about disasters in the news. And she, like David Mandel, she ultimately hit on a way to authenticate them and to date them. And so she would send herself emails, which automatically contain a timestamp. And anyway, she, just a few examples. I mean, she had a dream, I forget the exact date of this event, but she had a dream of an American airliner. She sent herself the email. American airliner. She thought it was either U.S. Airways or Southwest. Somehow crashing in the water or landing in the water in New York. But where everybody survived, and she had a vision. She had a vision, and she told her husband this after she had this dream of everyone standing on the wings of the plane, and it just seemed impossible. How can that be? Well, 6 hours later, the famous Miracle on the Hudson occurred, and the pictures of all the passengers spread out along the wings of this plane waiting to get picked up by boats went viral on the internet. Okay, and she has multiple other examples of this in the age of the internet, where images go viral, and it's this phenomenon is really interesting to track and to study, because other examples are similar to that. Where a dash cam of a car will capture a certain image of a plane about to crash, and then it goes viral, and then she's dreaming that image, and dreaming a lot of facts about it. Like in this case, she knew it was she was right about the airline. She thought it was Southwest or US Airways. I mean, that's as precise as it gets. I mean, her dreams are as precise as it gets as far as precognitive dreaming. But she didn't know exactly when this was going to happen, even though she was down to two possible airlines and a location. She was right about New York, and still, how would that be usable by anybody to prevent that? And then not to mention the issues of paradox that you're talking about, that if it had not occurred, she would not have the dream, and so on. So it would be paradoxical anyway. But
it also gets down to a point that you draw repeatedly in the book, which is that it's not that in her case she had a vision of being on the plane or anything like that. She had a vision of the media report
right.
that would come the next day. So you show examples of someone having a dream of a lot of people dying in something. It ends up that the number was wrong from the fact, but the number was what had been reported in the media.
Yes, exactly.
So it's this, we are responding to information that we receive.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the really beautiful thoughts you have in the book, and it's sort of like an idea you propose, is that we often encounter our future selves in our dreams, that maybe the angels in our dreams are future me's. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is a staple in science fiction, frankly, thanks to Philip K. Dick. He actually had this experience of encountering himself, waking up, seeing what he thought was himself standing over his bed. He wound up turning that into his story, Radio Free Albemuth. And there's the idea that people encounter sort of protective figures that may be interpreted as angels. It depends on no one thinks about precognition. No one. I often think of the Monty Python sketch, Spanish Inquisition. Someone mentions, well, I didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition, and then the Spanish Inquisition bursts out from behind a door. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Well, no one expects precognition, so we interpret it. We interpret these phenomena in other ways, almost invariably, and guardian angels. That's a very, very, prevalent idea in our culture, and so people are going to interpret this as an angel, as an angelic being that's protecting us or whatever. But I'm not trying to debunk people's spiritual beliefs, but another way of looking at that would be, this is your future self manifesting and protecting you, guiding you in a certain direction, and that's the way that it's sort of symbolically being presented in a dream or a vision or whatever. So yeah.
Another idea you really emphasize is that our premonitory dreams about the future use the building blocks of the present to present themselves. So they're rarely as literal as the David Mandel dream about 9/11. The symbolism of dreams tends to be a real thing, and but it's almost like our premonitory self is trying to speak to us in language we might understand now, but it's often, there's puns and there's strange parts in that too. Is that right?
Well, there's a sense in which, it has only a limited number of tools to work with, or materials in which to construct this little artwork that's sort of trying to show you something about something that hasn't happened, show you a thought or an idea that hasn't, that you haven't encountered consciously yet, but it's assembling things that have already happened in your life. Like that's what it has to work with, essentially. Um, and Freud's dream is a perfect example of this. I mean, the dream was really about everything in his life right then. It was about this patient that he was actually concerned about how she was doing. He was sort of on vacation, and she was on vacation, and he had just a friend of his who also appears in the dream had just the day before told him that she's not really hasn't really gotten better, and this was weighing on Freud. He was anxious about his sort of new method of treating people. And, he wanted to hear that his patients were getting better, and, she wasn't, apparently. And there were various other things going on in his circle of physicians. There was a lot of malpractice stuff going on in his circle of physicians. His best friend um, had committed malpractice, and nearly killed one of his patients. And there was a lot of bad stuff. And Freud was feeling guilt about that by association. In fact, it was one of his patients that his friend had nearly killed. And it's just, there was a lot of anxiety Freud was feeling. And so this dream was about all these figures in his life at that time. None of these figures were in his life 23 years later, with the possible exception of Anna. But, so he was taking figures from his life then to represent, I think, something in his life in the future. And that the fact that it was Anna, that his dream chose Anna, is, I think, significant because, and here we get to another time loop. Freud, this dream was so powerful and gave him, and was such a breakthrough for him. And that he even wrote in his book sort of a fantasy that he wrote to his best friend at the time, the one who committed malpractice. He wrote a fantasy that someday they will make a plaque on this house that here on this day Sigmund Freud discovered the key to dreams, or whatever. Well, in fact, Freud commemorated the dream by naming his next daughter Anna. Anna, his wife, was pregnant at that time, and I think a few months later she gave birth to a girl, and they named her Anna after Anna Hammerschlag in the dream. So he was naming his daughter after her. Now, fast forward 23 years. 23-year-old Anna Freud became his constant companion and nurse during his surgeries and during that whole last decade and a half of his life when he had to wear this horrible denture, and when he was just dealing with all this horrible medical stuff. It was Anna who was by his side, day in, day out, taking care of him, and was this incredible association to all those things. So if there was any character in his life in 1895, I believe, that would build a bridge to his experiences in starting in 1917. I think I'm maybe getting the years wrong. It was Anna, and so the dream picked another Anna. Anna Freud didn't exist at that point, but Anna Hammerschlag did. And so he put the symptoms in Anna Hammerschlag's mouth, instead of his own, which would have been paradoxical because it might have got him to stop smoking, but, it was another Anna that made that link. That's just one of the, like you said, that this story just has layers and layers that
so good. So good. So if you really lean into this, which you do at the end of the most recent book, the new book, it opens up this question of what is the subconscious? We have the spirit worlds, the dream worlds, and you put out like a tentative hypothesis, big question mark, that maybe the subconscious is the future. And it's the future being expressed through this coded language of the present. Is that what you've come to believe?
Yeah, that's my hypothesis. I mean, I can't prove that, but it really makes sense of Freud's, like I said, of Freud's meta psychology. That is to say, that iceberg model of the mind. Like I said, if you turn it on its side and make it, extend across time instead of extending somehow in space in an impossible way, it makes a lot of sense, of of everything that he wrote. And this is why I think that it's important to take Freud seriously. There's this kind of myth that Freud's been debunked or whatever, and people are thinking they have this kind of stereotype of Freud. Oh, he was all about sex and everything. And well, and yeah, a lot of that stuff has been kind of dismissed over the years. I mean, even psychoanalysts, even Freudian psychoanalysts, I don't think everything's about sex anymore, and they don't think everything's the Oedipus complex and all that. But the larger point, his larger thrust, that there is an unconscious, and it works in these kinds of roundabout, oblique ways to influence our behavior. That is actually been borne out by neuroscience. I mean, the thrust of a lot of um, kind of social neuroscience stuff of the last couple decades on priming effects and implicit processing and implicit biases and all that stuff. Though that word implicit, that just means unconscious. I mean, they're just taking a new word and putting it on an old construct. And so it really bears out a lot of what Freud was saying, at least the big picture of Freud. So yeah, I think it's very important to take him seriously. And the other reason it's important to take him seriously is that when you have this perspective, you realize how important, again, it comes back to that biography, the idea that we are a biography, we are a story, a very detailed, rich story, and it's it's messy. It's a messy story, and it's very novelistic. I think that's a very important perspective to have on our lives, and the long self that I'm kind of trying to get people to experience is drilling down into the sort of the confusing, complex mess of our lives and realize that there's an order there. There's a really interesting novelistic story there. We are foreshadowing. That's a novelistic trope. You know, and that's why That's why I always come back to Freud, even though people see Jung as being more of a precursor to this kind of mentality. Like I said, Jung's case studies are like little paragraphs, and he doesn't give you any details. He wasn't interested in the details of people's lives, but I think that we need to pay attention to the details of our lives, because that's what gives us a sense of our life's richness. And especially when you realize that those details, that embarrassing mistake I made back, at age 23 or whatever, maybe that wasn't just some random thing or some stupid thing. It actually may have been a necessary thing for me to come around to this point where I could look back on it now and realize, oh, wait a minute, I had to do that so I can become the person I am now. And it's that long self thinking, that, bento thinking, or at least, reverse bento bento backwards.
Totally.
That sense of the self as this rich biography, that's a Freudian viewpoint on the self. And so that's why I keep coming back to him.
What is your personal experience of being like the advocate for this idea? Like, to be an
Lonely.
occultist, to embrace the maybe least fashionable possible expansion of science. Like, what does this feel
Right.
like for you?
Well, it feels it's lonely and exciting. I mean, I think it's a very exciting field. I think that there's this new field ahead of us, and I don't give myself credit for this. This is a lot of people are coming to a similar realization. There are a lot of people out there doing similar work right now on precognition, on retrocausation. A lot of books are coming out about precognition, people, their own stories, telling their own stories about precognition. It's starting to penetrate the mainstream in a way that it never had before. I'll give you an example. The novelist Ayad Akhtar, who's the best-selling novel Homeland Elegies a few months ago, he actually, this is sort of I think a thinly fictionalized account of his life after 9/11, and he talks in there about his own precognitive dreams. And he was even on NPR interviewed by an interviewer and talked very openly about his precognitive dream experiences. And the interviewer didn't laugh at him or roll her eyes or whatever. I mean, they took him seriously because he's a New York Times best-selling novelist. And if a person like that can talk openly about these experiences, and not be seen as a kook, then that's good. We're making progress. And yeah, and that's my sort of goal with the new book, is to sort of, I call it sort of citizen science, because that's essentially what J.W. Dunn was doing nearly a century ago. With his book, he was trying to get people, okay, look, this is real, but you have to prove it for yourself, and you have to be part of this data gathering exercise so that we really start to understand this better. And I think, unfortunately, his book, while it was hugely popular at the time and influenced a lot of writers and so on, it got forgotten. And I think we need to bring back that mentality. But I think it's going to happen. I mean, I really, already the book is, this book is having an impact on people. I get emails almost every day from people telling me their stories, and it's just, it's amazing. It's very validating for me. It's like, yeah, this is a real thing. It's very prevalent. People experience this, and people who don't think they experience it suddenly realize, oh yeah, I do experience it.
Hmm.
you know? So,
I just have a couple last questions here. So I'm someone who rarely remembers their dreams,
mhm,
and I have waking visions. I have premonitions,
mhm,
like certainly some of the things you talk about, I'm very aware of, but I've only
mhm.
very rarely remember my dreams. Is that a matter of me not keeping a dream journal? Are there people that dream more than other people? Like, what does it mean, say, if I'm not?
It just means you're not remembering them. And it means that you're not in a habit of spending time to pay attention to them in the early morning when you're first waking up. Uh, I don't know about your lifestyle. I know people who are very busy often don't remember their dreams. People are in a habit of, when the alarm goes off, they leap out of bed and they're taking care of things. They're taking care of their kids. They're, getting ready for work. That's going to work against remembering your dreams. We all dream. We all dream sort of the vivid REM sleep dreams, 2.5 hours a night. We're dreaming probably in those other sleep phases as well, less vividly. So we're all dreaming. Dreaming is a function associated with forming memories and so on. But yeah, getting in a habit of noticing them and remembering them, that's something that some people don't naturally do. But putting a journal by your bedside with a pen will prime the pump for many people. Many people find that it acts like setting an intention or something, and like just that action, just setting a notebook and a pen by your bed
There's
the
some
next
valve that
morning.
opens up
Yeah,
suddenly.
some valve that opens up, and like, oh, you wake up, oh, that was a kind of nice dream, and you'll write it down, and it's very validating to have that experience if you're not used to it. So yeah, I always, the first step is just getting a notebook and a pen and just leaving it by your bedside at night, because it will, for most people, prime the pump. Yeah.
So at the end of the new book on precognitive dreaming, you quote a T.S. Eliot poem. He writes, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." So where do you hope we are arriving in this dream work, dream world? What is this exploration?
Well, it's an exploration of the self, and I think it's that sense of our lives as that vastly expanded richness of our lives, and the fact that who I was back back then. For me, the precognitive dream work ultimately leads us to the past. It's, people think it's only somehow about seeing the future. Well, it is, but what really does is get you to pay more attention to who you were and how you got to this point. And it's that coming full circle experience, that time loop experience that precognitive dreams give you on a repeated basis when you start doing this, is what really, wow, that really awakens you to a new dimension of the self and a new dimension of your life that is very, very powerful, very inspiring. And yeah, that's the hard part to convey, because people come into this topic expecting, well, I want this new superpower and I want to win the lottery. And it's like, well, it's probably not going to happen. It's not unheard of, but it's probably going to happen differently. But it's going to make your life 10 times more interesting, and it's going to make other people's lives more interesting, because of the ways that it connects you, to other people, the way other people fulfill your time loops for you. For instance, the Jung story, where it took Carl Jung to hand uh, um, Maggie, Carl, which is her name, hand her the scarab. It took that moment to fulfill her dream. So it was this bonding moment. And these kinds of events happen all the time. And the more you share, you have a shared understanding of precognition, and you have email encounters with people who have this shared understanding. It's like it becomes an ongoing paranormal experience, with other people, and other people help close your time loops, and you're closing other people's time loops, and it's wonderful to think of our lives not as just long selves, but as almost like DNA, like, intertwining with each other. And it's just very exciting, and very um, it's validating, and it enhances our sense not only of ourselves but of others. So it's like I was looking forward to talking a bit about Bentoism, because it is that kind of Bentoist philosophy, and that Bentoist kind of worldview. That there is a future me and there is a future us, and that precognition is part of weaving the I and the other
Right, giving
together.
the additional layers of meaning to a moment, like
Right,
allowing
right,
that connection to be, this is a real connection. It's not just we met eyes,
right,
but it fulfilled something, and all of
right,
that setting the course of our lives.
right.
This is amazing, Eric. Both Time Loops and Precognitive Dreamwork are fantastic books. I love them so much, and I've been looking forward to talking to you for a really long time. And this did not disappoint.
Thank you for having me. This has been a delightful conversation.